What's up, everybody? My name is Jeffrey Gardner. Welcome back once again to episode number 64 of Upset Alert. It is the ultimate college football podcast celebrating all 130 teams in FBS. Thank you, first and foremost, everyone watching live on twitch.tv/robot brain eater for bearing with us through a little bit of a false start right there as we had some audio issues on the video side of things. So thank you again to everyone for bearing with us through that. And of course, for those of you who are watching live on Twitch, please do feel free to jump in the chat and join in with your comments as we continue to work our way through every team in college football, previewing every single game on each of their schedules. Now, we have been ranking every team in college football from worst to first and previewing every game on their schedule. So we've made our way all the way through number 4. We, on yesterday's episode, discussed the LSU Tigers, the defending national champions. And today, we keep it in the SEC, but we jump divisions on you as we head to number 3. If for those who are on video, you see me in the red and black. I am talking about my Georgia Bulldogs here today at number 3. Now, remember, we use a preseason aggregate poll, so you're going to say, of course, you ranked Georgia ahead of the defending national champions. I did not rank them number 1 or anything like that. This is an aggregate poll again, so I am not the only person who put them in this spot right here. Now, of course, with the other teams that were previously in the discussion, Georgia was not quite at that number 3 spot, but they were pretty much a consensus top 5 or high, at least higher half of the top 10, somewhere in that general range. So this is a team that obviously a lot of folks are really high on for many, many reasons. I mean, you look at what Georgia did last year, the year before. I mean, really, the last 3 seasons, this has been a fantastic football team to varying degrees, right? So you take a look at last year's Georgia team, you see a lacking offense, a very strong defense. You look at 2018, maybe a little bit more balanced. And then 2017, of course, was a magical season where they were 1 and 26 away from beating Alabama for the national championship in Atlanta. So really a lot of things to get into with this Georgia Bulldogs team. I recognize that this is my alma mater and that I could talk about them for an hour, hour and a half, but that folks are listening from all backgrounds here, from all over the country. So I am not going to spend too much time blabbering on about all of my personal exploits with the University of Georgia. Instead, I'll try to keep it right around the half-hour-ish mark like we have been doing for every team on our countdown. So with all of that being said, there's no real specific news to get into in the world of college football today, though I will give a quick shout-out to Austin P. I know is kicking off the FCS season today. So FCS football is officially back today on Saturday, August the 29th. And of course, FBS football not too far behind, just 5 days away, coming on September the 3rd, Thursday, September the 3rd. We've got a couple of group of 5 matchups there. So as we continue to inch our way closer to the college football season, just a kind of housekeeping reminder, I suppose, of the way that our formatting is going to be and how we air the show. We'll continue to record every day live on video here on twitch.tv/robotbraineater for the next few days. So today, tomorrow, and the next day, we will preview the schedules for numbers 3, 2, and 1 on our preseason aggregate poll. And then once we get through every predicted game, the predicted outcomes of those games for the number 1 team in a country for the preseason, we will head on to our kind of conference championship predictions, college football playoff predictions, and then we'll go to our regular cadence, which will be 2 episodes a week. One kind of reviewing the games of that past week, one previewing the games for the coming week is essentially the way things are work. So just taking a quick peek at a calendar here to give you some idea of how that is going to work for us. Today, of course, the 29th, we'll have the preview for Georgia, number 3. Tomorrow, we will be previewing another SEC team. No spoilers really at this point. There's only 2 teams left on the countdown. So I think you guys can probably figure them out. So I'll go ahead and tell you here today. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about the Alabama Crimson Tide. And Monday, the 31st, we'll be talking about the consensus number 1, the unanimous number 1 from every preseason aggregate poll that we took into account for our preseason poll, the Clemson Tigers, the consensus number 1 there in all 14 polls we used. Then what we'll do is we'll take a day off September the 1st, which would be Tuesday. September the 2nd on Wednesday, we'll do our conference championship predictions and college football playoff predictions. And then after that, the college football season will be here on Thursday, September the 3rd. So looking forward to that very much. We'll go ahead and we'll get a little bit into kind of a preview type discussion in that college football playoff and conference championship prediction special there, where we get into some of those early week 1 matchups and discuss, a little bit of how we expect everything to go for those early games. Now, all of that being said, this episode, like I said, is going to be to discuss Georgia football and how we expect them to do in 2020. So let's do exactly that. Let's take a look at this Georgia schedule from last year to start things off here and see where the Bulldogs are coming from. So, of course, this is a team that is 12-2 on the season last year, 7-1 in the SEC. So, of course, dominant once again last year in the conference for the most part. Just the one loss against the South Carolina Gamecocks, which, of course, was the huge upset at home. They were 6-1 at home. They're 4-0 on the road, and then 2-1 you see in neutral site action, of course, playing in the conference championship game, their bowl game, and their annual neutral site matchup against the Florida Gators. So let's move down this schedule a little bit here and see what Georgia did in 2019. So they kicked things off against Vanderbilt last year. Was a pretty easy win, 30-6 there in Nashville to kick things off in conference play. Won 63-17 over FCS Murray State. Not much to talk about there. Another blowout win against a weaker team, Arkansas State. Georgia won 55-0 between the hedges last year. Before they got their first test, I would say, of the season last year was against Notre Dame. This was kind of a buzzing matchup, right? This was kind of a big talk of the offseason. Coming into last season was Georgia versus Notre Dame. They, of course, had an incredible matchup in 2017 in which Georgia came out by just a point ahead in that one. So 20-19 game back in 2017 up in South Bend. The Notre Dame comes to Athens last year. Of course, Georgia had the new lights going, crazy atmosphere. The Dogs came out on top in that one, 23-17, in what was, I think, a less than perfect game for Georgia there. But as you got into that one there, you did get the vibe coming out of that game because they won against a very high quality Notre Dame opponent there. This is a team that you were looking at and saying, really, the sky's the limit, right? For Georgia last season at that point. So moving forward, keep that in mind as we get into some of these games, because you'll start to see, I think, a trend of Georgia perhaps underperforming, at least on the offensive side of the football. So October 5th, in Knoxville, Tennessee, they pick up a win. This one turned into more of a blowout than it probably should have been. 43-14 against Tennessee. That one was close for a portion of the game, I think, but the Dogs, of course, coming out on top by a significant margin at the end of that one. Then the big one, right? You lose to South Carolina at home. This is a South Carolina team that, while they had flashes last year, ultimately went 4-8. Certainly not someone that you were expecting to give you a serious game, and much less someone that you were going to lose to at this point in the season. So a tough loss to swallow. Of course, you look back at this one, it was kind of the perfect comedy, the perfect storm, kind of comedy of errors for the Georgia Bulldogs in that game. Rodrigo Blankenship, who was their star kicker for 4 seasons, was great in his entire time pretty much at Georgia. Missed 2 field goals in this game, which he almost never did. It goes to double overtime, low scoring game too, 20-17. The final in that one was just a sloppy game from Georgia. I mean, they pretty much everything that went wrong for Georgia that could have gone wrong did in that game. And South Carolina found a way to pull it out, even with Ryan Helinski, their starting quarterback, missing a good portion of that game due to injury. So you can't really write this one off entirely as a fluke, because what you have to say here is that Georgia can't have games like this, right? Especially in a season coming into 2020 in which it's going to be a conference only schedule. This SEC grind is going to be even tougher than it ever has been before. They're going to have 10 quality opponents of varying degrees, obviously. So you're still going to play your South Carolinas in there, your Vanderbilts, your Arkansas, and people like that on the schedule this year. But you're going to have those mixed in between your Floridas and your Alabamas and games like that, your Auburns. So it's going to be a tough schedule if you let teams like South Carolina get the best of you because you just don't get off the bus that day or because you just don't execute that day. And Georgia, bottom line, cannot afford to have a game like this in 2020, or they won't even make it to Atlanta. That is the bottom line this year. I think just with the way their schedule sets up, the way that the entirety of the SEC schedule sets up, it's going to be a tough ask to be able to accomplish their goals, which of course would include winning the East and winning the conference eventually to make it to a college football playoff. It's going to be a really tough ask to do that if this is a team that's going to have a hard time with someone like South Carolina, or you could throw in Kentucky or Tennessee, someone like that in 2020. So Georgia's got to keep their head on a swivel for teams like South Carolina this coming season. They have got to really, pay better attention, I suppose, and not play down to the level of their opponents. And you'll see kind of some of this happens later on in the season as well. It was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for Georgia there. You play Kentucky on October 19th. This is 21-0. The score is not the full story of this game here. Georgia played very sloppy. If I recall, it was 0-0 at halftime, actually. And this was a torrential downpour in Athens that day. So Georgia played a very sloppy game. So did Kentucky, but Kentucky had a third string quarterback at this point who was in there for them. Georgia's defense was not going to let Kentucky score on this day, but their offense's ineptitude was holding them back in this game, like in so many others last year. Georgia's offense was just not what it had been in the 2 years prior. Jake Fromm took a step back last year. The wide receiver core as a whole took a big step back last year. There were a lot of drop passes, a lot of missed throws, and maybe some very vanilla play calling there as a result of a lack of trust in those two departments there, kind of. Not to mention, I don't think Georgia had the same level of playmaking ability on their offensive line and running backs room last season as they have with, of course, Sony Michel and Nick Chubb, two of the best running backs in program history who had just graduated the year prior. So you take a look further. It's Florida. November the 2nd. Coming into this game, there were a lot of question marks for Georgia. A lot of folks picking Florida in this game because Florida had one of the sexiest losses in all of college football, which was that two-score loss against LSU. Of course, they put up 28 on an LSU team that didn't really have too many teams put up 4 scores on them. And you know, just played them close for the whole game. So Florida had that really sexy loss. They had some good looking wins on the resume already at this point, too. Georgia, you get the Notre Dame win, and that's pretty much what you're hanging your hat on at this point. Coming into this game, Georgia controlled this game 24-17. I'll give credit where credit's due. Like I said, 21-0. The game was closer than that score was. 24-17 against the Gators. The game was not as close as that score was. This game could have easily been 31-10 or something of that liking. Georgia was dominant in this game for probably 3.5 quarters or so, and they took their foot off the gas pedal a little bit to let the Gators make it a little closer toward the end. But this was a good performance against a very good Florida Gators football team. It was the anomaly in the late part of the season where Jake Fromm did complete more than 50% of his passes, and really a breakout performance, you would say, for wide receiver Lawrence Cager last year as well against those Gators. Missouri on November the 9th, and I'll kind of fly through the last few of these here. Missouri was a 27-0 win for Georgia. Not much to talk about there other than Missouri is not great. Auburn, a fairly close one, 21-14. Auburn was a good football team last year. This was another game, though, where Georgia's offense prevented them from making this less of a game than it should have been. This it was a 21-14 game. Had Georgia been able to capitalize more, you take Georgia's offense from either of the two prior years, and I think this is probably 35-14 or 31-14 at least, something in that range. Same story for this Texas A&M game, November 23rd. You can give this one a lot of the credit, at least, to Rodrigo Blankenship, their veteran kicker. Got the job done for the Dawgs because their offense could not get into the end zone very much. It was a 19-13 game against a pretty good A&M team. And then you look at November 30th. If there's one thing that you can count on normally in a normal season of college football, death, taxes, and Georgia beating the tar out of Georgia Tech. It was 52-7 on November 30th last year. Let's move on to the SEC Championship, and this postseason for Georgia really was a tale of almost two completely different performances here. This SEC Championship game, and it's important to note that their star wide receiver, their breakout true freshman last year, George Pickens, got himself ejected from that Georgia Tech game in the second half for throwing a punch. Therefore, he was out for the entire first half of this SEC Championship game. He was the only wide receiver, other than Lawrence Cager, who was out for the year with injury at this point, that Jake Fromm had been able to rely on in any consistent fashion for the duration, really, of the regular season. So you look at this LSU game on December 7th of last year. First of all, you knew coming in LSU was one of the best college football teams you had seen in a long time. They had a spectacular season last year. I mean, it's hard to think of any word other than perfect or as close to perfect as you can be when it comes to the season that LSU put together last year, the wins that they strung together week after week, the crazy numbers that they put up on offense last year. You just had a feeling, or at least I did, as a Georgia fan going in, that it probably wasn't going to be the Dawgs' day. And with that blow to their offense, George Pickens not being out there, that's not going to do them any favors because this was already a pretty inept Georgia offense for the bulk of the season. They did have a great defense, of course. Georgia had a great defense last year, so you come into a game like this and think maybe their defense can hold this LSU offense. No, I don't think the Hoover Dam could have held this LSU offense 37-10. That's really all there is to say about it. Joe Burrow did Joe Burrow things, and it's just the defense can only hold so long against an offense that good, especially when your offense is going out there for Georgia and just three and out or turning the ball over. It's not a good look. It was a bad performance overall in that SEC championship game. Not that you can really you really could have expected much different from the Dogs because that LSU team was just so darn good last season. Moving on though to the Sugar Bowl. This is the big positive to take away from the end of the season for Georgia last year. Another one that I'm going to give credit where credit's due. 37-10 probably was actually closer than that game actually was against LSU. This Sugar Bowl game, though, 26-14, I think Georgia beat Baylor worse than that score shows. That's only a 12-point game. Georgia shut Baylor out in the first half. Um, they really let a lot of young guys play in this. Of course, you had some guys foregoing that final game as well, or some injuries to key positions. Um, this was a big statement win for Georgia that they're going to bounce back from losses like that LSU loss, I think. And so this was a positive for sure. And of course, this was George Pickens' coming out party. He went absolutely off in the game, was the MVP in the football game. Just an incredible receiving performance. Some crazy like circus catches, not to mention the yards after the catch. Just a big play wide receiver in George Pickens for the University of Georgia for many years to come. And this Baylor game was kind of his coming out party. And so you see looking forward that this not only does this team now have a wide receiver, it seems, at least one that they can consistently look to in big play situations. And they also have that consistency on defense because this was a great Georgia defense last year. But I think they showed with the talent of the young players, they got to see significant playing time in that Sugar Bowl game. That these are guys that can go out there and make big time plays in a big time football game, despite being kind of the young, highly recruited type of guys. They may not have quite as much playing time. This is a Georgia defense that I think is going to be elite for years to come. And with that in mind, let's start talking about this 2020 football season for the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, of course, the SEC this year is kicking things off a little later than some of the other Power 5 conferences. They're kicking things off on September the 26th, and they will be playing a 10-game conference-only schedule. Let's start in week one here with Arkansas. The University of Georgia got a pretty good draw. Let's call it like it is. When it came to adding their two additional conference games, of course, they normally play 8 in the SEC. They're playing 10 this year. However, the reason why they got a pretty good draw is Georgia plays Auburn every year from the West, and they're playing Alabama this year from the West. They were already on the schedule. So when you're playing two of the top 3 teams out of that division already, you're going to get a pretty easy draw to balance that out when it comes to adding those two games. So they get Arkansas and Mississippi State added to the schedule. They're gonna play at Arkansas and versus Mississippi State. We'll get to Mississippi State later, but for now, let's try to hurry through some of these easier games, or at least easier game that Georgia gets to start off with here. So September the 26th at Arkansas. Honestly, there's not a ton to say there. I've mentioned it when I've talked about other SEC teams playing Arkansas. Sam Pittman is a brand new head coach, used to coach at Georgia, of course, the offensive line as recently as last season before he got the job at Arkansas. I like the energy that Sam Pittman has. I think he's a great recruiter, and I think he's got some good offensive and defensive coordinators and assistant coaches around him there to build an interesting staff at Arkansas, maybe over the next half decade or so, if they give him the time to work. But this year is not going to be the year for Arkansas, right? I mean, you talk about a transfer quarterback from Florida in Felipe Franks, who obviously has played against Georgia defenses, knows what that's all about. Um, but he's just kind of I think, a middle of the pack type SEC quarterback at best. So I don't think he's really going to come in and make an immediate impact, though he is a good veteran presence to have on your football team. Bottom line is Arkansas has just got too many holes. They've got talent at quarterback, like I said. Felipe Franks, if nothing else, not super accurate, but has a cannon for an arm. You have a great running back in Raheem the Dream Boyd, straight out of Last Chance U. You've got a pretty decent offensive line, and if not the most talented offensive line, you've got a head coach who sure knows how to coach an offensive line for sure. That's been his job his entire career, pretty much. Um, but there's just too many holes for Arkansas. This is undoubtedly, for me, a win for Georgia in week one. They're 1-0. October the 3rd versus Auburn. Auburn comes to Athens this year, and that is crucial that Georgia gets back to back home games on October 3rd and October 10th, because this is a tough stretch that this game starts for the Dogs. They've got Auburn, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, and Florida all in a row. And by the way, if you hadn't heard yet, Kentucky is not a bad team this year. Neither is Tennessee, really, by my estimation. When we picked our schedule, when we picked everyone's records as we thought they would be a 12-game schedule, I picked Tennessee to go 9-3. Actually, I thought this Tennessee team had the potential to be really good. They're going to be one of those teams that might not get to show how good they are this season, simply because they are playing now in an all SEC schedule, and that's going to make things a little tougher on the Volunteers. But I like that Tennessee Volunteers team this year. They're pretty good. So, anyways, let's back up a little bit. We're on October 3rd versus Auburn. Georgia versus Auburn in Athens. I like that this game's played in Athens. Georgia, for the most part, you of course can't ignore the elephant in the room that in 2017, Georgia's kind of magical run to the college football playoff and then to the national championship game. Their stumble was at Auburn. Auburn beat the brakes off of Georgia that day. It looked like the Dogs never got off the bus. So you can't ignore that. You cannot ignore that. That, of course, was in Kirby Smart's second year as the head coach at Georgia. So he had that experience. This was not something you can put on the previous coach there or anything like that, and Mark Richt. But this is something that you also have to take with a little bit of a grain of salt, because Georgia, for the most part, over the last, we'll say, decade, has pretty much dominated Auburn. For the most part, they have been really good against Auburn. You've seen the occasional stumble, and I think when you do, it's been at Auburn. You think about 2013, if you want to go that far back, the prayer at Jordan Hare game that you had there. But you think about big Georgia wins against Auburn teams that were higher ranked. Back in 2016, for example, Georgia toppled Auburn in a year where Georgia wasn't a particularly great team. That was a down year for them. First year head coach in Kirby Smart. Auburn was a top 10 team at the time coming to Athens. Georgia picked up the win there. I think just in general, Georgia has Auburn's number. And I'll tell you, first and foremost, as a Georgia fan, my honest feeling when I look at the schedule, I'm not worried about Auburn. And so I think Georgia is going to win this game in week 2 here. And I don't know if it's even by just a score. I think it might be a 2 or 3 score game, honestly. If Georgia's offense is even a little better than it was last year, Their defense, I think, is going to be plenty to shut down this Auburn offense for the most part. It's just a question of Georgia's offense. How much has it improved? Because you've seen what this Auburn defense can do, even though they do have some big time replacements to be made on their defensive front this year. So we've got Georgia at 2-0. Let's head to play Tennessee here. Again, this game is in Athens, and I like a lot that it is in Athens because last season, kind of my dark horse game that I was worried about was at Tennessee. Now, Tennessee in the weeks leading up to that game turned out to be real bad. At that time, they lost to Georgia State and to BYU. But of course, we saw later in the season that Tennessee rebounded. We saw what they can be when they went on that long winning streak to end the season, and of course went on to win their bowl game as well. Um, this is a Tennessee team that I really think can challenge someone. They probably can pull an upset on one of these big teams that they're playing this year, if any of them. I don't think it's going to be Georgia. This is a tough spot to play Tennessee because Alabama and Auburn on either side of this game. But I just think the talent disparity is too wide here. I think Georgia is going to win that football game against Tennessee. I think they're 3-0 headed into the biggest game to this point on the season at Alabama. October the 17th. Now I hesitate to call it the biggest game on the schedule for Georgia just because it doesn't have division specific implications in the way that the Florida game does, and Florida will still of course be a top 10 team as well. But Alabama is our preseason number 2, only behind Clemson, right? So that means that even after losing their division last year to the eventual national champions, the LSU Tigers, this year people are still high enough on Alabama that they favor them more than LSU. That says a lot about the just powerhouse of a football program that Nick Saban has built for the Crimson Tide, and no team knows that better than the Georgia Bulldogs. This is going to hurt me to talk about, right? Because I can go all the way back to my freshman year and talk about that incredible 2012 SEC championship game with Aaron Murray at quarterback for the Dawgs, A.J. McCarron his year at quarterback for the Alabama Crimson Tide there. We can talk all about that and the back and forth of Eddie Lacy and TJ Yeldon for Alabama versus Todd Gurley and Keith Marshall, running backs for Georgia, as true freshmen that year. That was one of the greatest SEC championship games in football of all time. I think back in 2012, Georgia had control late in that game. Tide took the lead, and of course, you know the rest. Alabama wins. You move on. Next one in line, 2015 regular season. Alabama comes to Athens. I think most Georgia fans would have told you they knew it wasn't going to be the year for Georgia to win this game, but we still got excited. It was a top 10 matchup in Athens that day. Georgia had a Virginia transfer quarterback who none of you will remember called Grayson Lambert as the starting quarterback for that season. Georgia, of course, got blown out on their home turf by the Crimson Tide that day. That was the least exciting matchup in this series over the last decade. Keep moving along, though. Move to 2017. This is where it starts to get really painful for the Georgia Bulldogs and the Georgia Bulldogs fans right here because of the way these games were lost. 2017, the national championship game in Atlanta. Georgia has a multiple score lead going. They look dominant at the half, right? Flash forward, a guy named Tua Tagovailoa comes and plays his first ever snaps as a college football quarterback as a true freshman, and he just makes moves. He just makes some crazy, crazy plays, including, of course, the infamous 2nd and 26 in overtime. Looked like Georgia had that game wrapped up, despite everything that Alabama had done to come back and take it to overtime. Second and 26, Alabama wins. 2018, I won't go too far into the details of this one, but SEC championship game. Tua gets hurt. Jalen Hurts, his backup, comes in and beats Georgia in a comeback fashion. This is a Georgia team that cannot get over this hump. So I have to tell you, as a Georgia fan, looking at this schedule, when I was looking at the 12 game schedule before, I thought, you know what? Alabama, I think, took a little bit of a half step back. I think they continue to stay in that range, and I think Georgia actually comes a little bit better this year. So looking at the 12 game schedule previously, I said Georgia's going to beat Alabama. However, that prediction is never going to hit the books because now the schedule we're working with has Georgia playing Auburn, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, and Florida all in a row. And when I'm looking at this 10 game SEC schedule and I'm looking for a loss for Georgia, I see one in that stretch because that is just too tough of a stretch to come out unscathed, I think. And the most logical place for that loss to come, I am so sorry to my fellow Georgia Bulldog fans to say, and I hope I'm wrong, is October 17th at Alabama. I think the Crimson Tide rolls on that day. I think it's going to be a great football game. But that is something that I think might just be too much for the Dogs to handle. They're still early in the season at this point, right? This is the fourth game of the year at Alabama. There is still a lot of time to bounce back, of course. This would not be the end of the year to lose this game, especially to a Western Division opponent. But I just can't imagine Georgia getting through Auburn, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, and Florida with 0 losses. I can't imagine it. I don't know if anyone in the SEC is capable of going undefeated with this SEC only schedule for 10 games. But with this stretch especially, I don't think it's Georgia. If anyone does, maybe Alabama, but I don't know. They got some tough stretches too. So let's keep moving along here. We got Georgia at 3-1 through 4 games, and we'll fly through some of these because I know I am dragging a little bit. I'm getting sentimental, which I said I would not do. So let's take a look here. Kentucky, next on the list, October 24th. I will tell you, at Alabama and versus Florida on either side of this game, this Kentucky game is a classic trap game. If Georgia beats Alabama, watch out for Kentucky in the following week. This game is in Lexington, which is actually not that short of a drive. It's actually a longer drive than you might think from Athens, Georgia. This is not an easy win at all. Kentucky's a good football team this year. They're probably either number 3 or 4 in the East this year, behind, of course, Georgia and Florida, possibly Tennessee as well, in my opinion at least. But this is a really good Kentucky football team. They've got some offensive firepower. They don't have the talent on defense like Georgia does. But if Georgia's offense is still the weak link, then maybe you consider that a matchup a wash or maybe a slight advantage for Georgia. You look at this Georgia defense versus this Kentucky offense, could be an interesting matchup. I think that will tell the story of this game. I do think Georgia gets past this with a win. Might be a little bit closer than you would expect, though. This might be the most unexpected challenge for the season for Georgia, mostly because of where it falls in the schedule, like I said. And thankfully, after Kentucky, you get a bye week. You get a nice, much-needed bye week here. But November 7th, you better be ready again, especially if you already have a loss on the schedule. But regardless, this is the biggest game of the year. November 7th versus Florida in Jacksonville. They are still playing this in Jacksonville, despite the limits on fan attendance for this college football season. And I'm going to tell you straight up right now, I like the Dogs in this game. A lot of folks are really high on Florida, folks picking Florida to win the East. This is their year, now or never. You're going to hear a lot of talk like that over the next several weeks leading up to this football game. I'm not buying it. Personally, I am just not buying it. Kyle Trask is a good quarterback, right? Florida's going to have a good defense. They pretty much always do. They've got some playmakers at the wide receiver position. They had all of that, but better last season. Kyle Trask may take a slight step forward, but their defense is going to take a step back. They are losing two of the top defensive ends that have been in this program over the last half decade or so. They don't show me anything, Florida that is. Florida doesn't show me anything that makes me think they're going to take that big jump to beat Georgia this year. Because basically, if you're telling me if Florida beats Georgia, that they're likely to beat LSU on this regular season as well, which to me would say Florida's probably a college football playoff team, or at least a serious contender to win the SEC. And I don't buy into Florida like that at all. I think Florida's a top 10 team for sure. Maybe eventually a top 5 team, depending on how this season goes. But I didn't pick Florida to beat LSU. I'm not picking them to beat Georgia either. I don't see what's allowing them to take that next step. So I like the Dogs on November 7th. Let's fly through these last few because I got to be frank with you. If Georgia makes it through that stretch, ending with Florida, and they're in the driver's seat, they control their own destiny, they are going to Atlanta. And they are going to Atlanta without too much adversity in their way because these are the last 4 games of their schedule at Missouri versus Mississippi State, at South Carolina versus Vanderbilt. Who out of those 4 is going to beat them? I know they lost to South Carolina last year. You don't have to remind me of that. Of course, I know this team's capable of dropping the ball. But who out of those 4 teams would you pick to beat Georgia? Absolutely none of them. Missouri, let's start right there. November 14th at Missouri. They have a good head coach. That's the best thing I can say about the Missouri Tigers this year. I don't think they're a good football team. I just don't. I think they are at best the 4th best team in the East. They are probably 5th or 6th in the East. This is not a great football team. They're going to lose a lot of games this year. They have one of the toughest, most grueling schedules in all of college football this season. They got the short end of that extra SEC opponent stick. That's a Georgia win. Mississippi State, November 21st. They're coming to Athens between the hedges. They were just there in 2017 when they were a good team and they got destroyed 31-3 by that magical Georgia Bulldogs team. Mississippi State is not good. They do have a first-year head coach. That is first year at Mississippi State. Obviously, he's been around forever. But first year at Mississippi State for Mike Leach this year, bringing some exciting things to the team. Maybe for 3 years down the road. This team is not good right now. I like the Dogs in that one by a lot. The Georgia Dogs, that is, I should say. South Carolina, November the 28th. The Dogs are not going to lose to South Carolina 2 years in a row. They're going to come into this game with a chip on their shoulder. I don't care that it's in Columbia. Columbia, when the fans are there, is one of the tougher environments in the division. Of course, fans likely to be limited, if any, even that late in the season. Georgia is a far superior team to South Carolina. They will not lose, mark my words, 2 years in a row to South Carolina. That's a Georgia win. Which puts Georgia at 8-1 coming into their season finale, their regular season finale, that is, against the Vanderbilt Commodores. What an exciting way to end the regular season, right, Georgia fans? You don't get Georgia Tech this year, so they gave you another team in black and gold for that final regular season game. Vanderbilt, will call a spade a spade. They are the worst team in the SEC East this year on paper. If Missouri or South Carolina or someone else finds a way to be worse than Vanderbilt this year, then they will be truly, truly terrible because Vanderbilt is real bad. And I like Georgia to put up a big, crooked number on Vanderbilt in this football game. They're going 9-1. That is my feeling. That is my final judgment on the Georgia Bulldogs. They are going 9-1. I'm not 100% positive on where the loss is going to come, to be honest with you. But I think they're going to go 9-1. They're going to lose to the Alabama Crimson Tide in the regular season. And you know what? It could just as easily be Kentucky. It could just as easily be maybe Tennessee surprising them or an Auburn. I, I don't think it's Auburn, but I think it'd be more likely to be Kentucky or Tennessee than Auburn, honestly. Um, but Alabama's the most likely candidate. If you want to talk about floors and ceilings, this team is not going worse than 8-2. To me, this year, I don't think it would take a disaster for them to go worse than 8-2. 10-0 is on the table. It is 1,000% on the table. If this Georgia team beats Alabama, I would pick them to go 10-0 because if you get that kind of momentum early in the season going, this team is young and they're only going to get better as the year goes on. But like I said, I could go on all day talking about Georgia football. I know you guys don't want to be here for 2 or 3 hours. We've already gone over 45 minutes at this point, one of our longer episodes. So let's go ahead and wrap it up for episode 64 of Upset Alert. For those of you who are on Apple Podcasts, please do subscribe to us on there. Give us that 5-star review. We greatly appreciate it. It helps us get more eyeballs and more ears on the podcast. For those of you on Spotify, please do follow us on there. And if you are on any of the other podcast services around the world, please do check us out on there. Leave us whatever the equivalent of a follow or a subscribe is on your service of choice, and a review as well. Helps us get out to more people. If you want to watch the show live on video, we tend to record around 5 or 5:30 p.m. It's been drifting a little later toward that 5:30 marker every day lately, just due to my personal life, kind of scheduling things throughout the day. So yeah, around 5:30 every day we've been recording on video on twitch.tv/robotbraineater. So if you want to get notifications on when we go live to record the podcast, then follow me on there. Again, that's twitch.tv/robotbraineater. That is my personal account. So feel free to give me a shout on there and hop in the chat while we're recording and just drop your thoughts on college football, whether it's on the Georgia Bulldogs or your team or just college football in general. I'll be happy to read your comments live on the air. Until tomorrow, when we will talk about the number 2 team in college football, who I already told you on our list is the Alabama Crimson Tide. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you tomorrow.